live. Not live, because we're not live on this October 24th, 2023. It's a fancy expert business pants. I'm your analyst, Matt Moscardi. Damian Rollis is in the studio with me. Today's episode doesn't suck because we have a special Woke Wednesday with arguably the fanciest expert we've ever had on business pants, Mr. Jon Lukomnik. Jon is the founder of Sinclair Capital and the host of the Outside In with Jon Lukomnik podcast. He's written 3 books, more than 50 articles dealing with investing theory and governance and future beta, all sorts of stuff. He's a High Meadows Institute fellow, a professor at Columbia. He was an executive director at IRRC for almost a decade, and he started his career in the Comptroller's Office of New York City in the 90s, which means if it's been done, Jon's seen it. Now, we had a long conversation. We hit like a lot of stuff. But we're going to cut it down for Woke Wednesday just to focus in on the anti-woke. And we're going to do a little governance game at the end. Here's Jon Lukomnik talking about fancy stuff. So one of the things that struck me about, and you spent 10 years at IRRC, you've been all over the place. But at the Comptroller's Office, I'm thinking about the fact that you are in a democratic government. So like taking not progressive stance, but like, because I think politics or like, the view of politics in investing was very different in 1998 than it is today. But I'm wondering how different it is like then versus now when we're seeing like in Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana and, South Carolina, and where they're effectively using like what is a data set on environment as a cudgel against asset managers somehow, because these asset managers are lemmingly conventionally failing on something like carbon, because none of them are taking like big future views. They're basically just doing what everybody else is doing. Was it different then than it is now? Were you under pressure then to do things that were politically motivated at all? Or is that is this a newer phenomenon and it's pretty specific to the anti-ESG crowd at this point?
I can unpack that into a really big set of questions because I think that there are a bunch of assumptions built into your question.
I do that all the time. I'm a terrible interviewer.
I teach systems level investing now at the graduate school, the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia. And one of the things I say is for an issue to have an effect on the environmental, social, and financial systems on which our capital markets rely, because let's face it, value and risk of creating the real world are only priced in the financial markets. It has to be big enough, right? Like whether or not I paint the office at General Motors purple or blue or pink or orange isn't a big enough issue, right? Whether I discriminate against women is a big issue. Whether I deal with carbon change is a big issue. Income inequality is a big issue. Antimicrobial resistance, all the sort of systemic things that we deal with. Once you're a big enough issue, there are going to be political views because it plays out. It has to be big enough to affect society and the economy. So there are going to be politicians involved. So there are always politicians involved. What's different now is we were told to figure it out from a fiduciary viewpoint of what's best and worst for the beneficiaries. And we were allowed to go where we want. It's a little bit like how for years Republicans have said you're not allowed to compile statistics, the federal government isn't allowed to compile statistics on gun violence because they had a political view, and so they didn't allow it. So for instance, you mentioned Texas, or as I call it, the United Soviet Socialist Republic of Texas. I find it fascinating. I'll give you a little story. A year ago, the Texas General Land Office writes to the state comptroller, a gentleman named Glenn Hager, who is keeping the Christmas list of good children and bad children.
Nice, yeah, that's my favorite list. Yeah,
and obviously BlackRock is a bad child in their view because they believe BlackRock is boycotting oil and gas, and the Texas General Land Office says, we have these private equity funds from BlackRock. And, we don't have to divest from them. What do you think? And Mr. Hager says, well, you really should rethink what you're doing because it's BlackRock. Now, do you know what those private equity funds were? They were oil and gas infrastructure funds, right? So when I say the Soviet Socialist Republic, let's go through this. What the Soviet Union did was say, here are going to be our favored and disfavored sectors of the economy. Okay, Texas does that. They say we want to favor oil and gas. Then they say, here are the players who are doing well and poorly in that. And now we have our favorite apparatchiks and the people we're going to make comrades of the Soviet Party, or in this case, the Texas Republican Party. And then at some point you forget the rationale you're doing this to begin with, and you just have people you favor and people you disfavor. And so Mr. Hager is saying, yeah, you ought to get rid of your oil and gas because we want to protect oil and gas. And that sort of political irrationality didn't exist.
Well, I'm glad actually to know that there's been some progress.
Right. I mean, there's great progress. Look, it took a bunch of left-wing autocrats, 70 years to reach that state in the Soviet Union. It took Texas 10 months. So there's great productivity in being autocratic and stupid. They've gotten much better at it.
I still can't get over the tremendous irony that in order to create their good children, bad children list, they went and bought data from MSCI, and we only know that because MSCI had to reduce their fee under the threshold that Texas had set for. Above this threshold, it has to be audited, and they bought ESG data and then used it in reverse, which brings me to the question of, is it what they're doing really that different from the ESG side? It's kind of a form of beta activism, albeit it's stupider, but they're using a data set to make a decision about a portfolio decision.
No, I'm going to reject that, Matt, because the reality is they may be using that methodology, but they have decided ex ante what the answer is. And they're working backwards. They're saying, right, we know that you should be doing oil and gas. We know you should. By the way, at the same time, they're taking tens of billions of dollars in IRA money to build solar farms and a bunch of other things. That's a different issue. And so it's sort of like this, we are going to tell you, Galileo, that the sun revolves around the earth, whether or not you have the evidence. And I think that what ESG people at least hopefully try to do, and I will admit there are people who start from the sky is falling, we have to save planet and earth, and therefore everything fits within our paradigm. But what I think intelligent ESG people try to do is say, here's the data, here's the extrapolation, what's the logical conclusion? As opposed to, here's the conclusion, how do we make the data fit? So while they both use data, one is using it to argue from a conclusion, and one is using it to reach a conclusion. I think those are two very different things.
Except that there's a branch of ESG data in particular that deals with sort of morality, right? Like in which there is a predetermined conclusion that, abortion is bad, or like whatever a religious reason, a moral reason, and they're using that data for that same reason. Mm-hmm. And there are pension funds who are invested. When you look at the constituent indexes, the ESG indexes, one of the underlying, things in those indexes, in the methodology, is they almost always X tobacco, X some form of arms, like usually cluster bombs or something like that, because clients have asked for it. But it means it's pre-built in. There's a moral pre-built into a lot of these indexes, not all. But I don't know that the pension funds know that that's built in there. But the fact is, on both sides, there are sort of, it seems like two legs of the same stool in as much as they have a conclusion, they're then using the data to backtrack it into their portfolio. The downside in Texas being they're actually, it would be like, if I'm, anti-abortion or anti-women's health rights, if I went out and said like, all right, remove that from my portfolio, and at the same time added all, women's health rights providers into my portfolio, because they're axing oil and saying they discriminate against oil. It makes no sense.
You raise a good point. First off, if you're not a fiduciary, feel free to invest according to your values, right? No problem. You're investing your own money. You want to invest only in coal-fired power plants. I think you're making a mistake, but that's fine. When you're someone else's fiduciary, you have an obligation to make sure that your personal political views don't get in the way. You can consider them, you can think about them, but ultimately you're a fiduciary. But that's sort of where most people's conventional discussion stops. I'm going to go a step further. How does something become material, right? Ooh. And there are values and morals built into that discussion, because the two ways things become material that weren't previously, and I'll give you a great example in a second, is either scientific knowledge evolves. The reason that climate change wasn't an issue in the 1970s was we didn't know it was an issue, or morals evolve. So let me ask you, what was the single largest source of collateral for the London bank loan market in the early 19th century? George
Soros.
He wasn't alive, and thank you for the anti-slavery remark. It's fine.
Thanks for injecting that.
But it was the lives of black Southern slaves, right? In the London bank loan market in the early 19th century was the lives of Southern slaves. They were viewed as collateral. They were property. They were, right? Clearly, as the morality of slavery became obvious, or the immorality of slavery became obvious, despite Ron DeSantis's new curriculum in Florida, as the immorality of slavery became obvious, that became a much riskier and therefore material to the loan market issue. Mm-hmm. And so over time, some of those value issues, or values, personal values, become real value, market moving price issues. And it tends to go in, someone raises an issue, it either gets traction or doesn't. Then there's reputational risk. Then there's regulatory risk. And so it's not as simple as saying statically at this moment, we were talking about future beta and future things, statically at this moment, this isn't a material risk. You may be right, but I think you have an obligation, depending on your time frame, to say, could it become, if so, when, how do I deal with it?
Well, the SEC would not agree with your definition of materiality, because they basically say any piece of information, or SEC, the Supreme Court. Supreme Court.
They would, well, there's an interesting tension there too. So the Supreme Court definition of materiality is a piece of information which in the totality would cause a reasonable investor to think differently. But what's interesting there, if you think about it, is the determinant of what's material is the reasonable investor.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But the determinant of the disclosure of what they think is material is a company. And so you have this tension, and I think it's now being played out in shareholder commons, which disclosure I'm on the board of, raises this all the time, that if I'm a portfolio investor, what your company does to the environmental system matters, but it may not matter for your company in terms of maximizing enterprise value. So there's this tension, and I think we're right at this phase where that's going to be worked out over the next 15, 20 years. What's material in terms of affecting the systems on which the health of the capital markets rely, as opposed to the enterprise value of the individual company that's making the determination of what to disclose. So there's a weird thing. So I'm not sure that the Supreme Court would disagree with them saying. They would say if you're a reasonable investor And that's why I said the process of going through it and documenting it and bringing people along, they will give deference to a reasonable investor's decision, not a company's decision.
I don't know if Brett Kavanaugh would. I mean, I'm not. I don't know
Brett
him
Kavanaugh
personally.
was the lawyer for the Council of Institutional Investors at one point.
Was he really?
Is that right?
Sarah hired who was the first executive director, hired him at one point, and when he was under attack, wrote a defense of him, which I thought was misguided, but
Yeah.
there it is.
He doesn't
The world
seem
is
like
a strange place. What can I tell you guys?
Hey, a job's a job.
Yeah, it was a gig. I have a side question here, because it does seem like, and when we're talking about, the rational investor, it's the prudent man theory, right? And it's the man part that I'm interested in, because the anti-ESG crowd, the anti-woke crowd, this is called a awkward segue, but I want to get into the question of whether or not, it seems like there's two factors playing out with all of Vivek Ramaswamy and Strive Asset Management on one hand, which is quietly anti-women and people of color. That just seems, when you look at the voting record of Strive, for instance, they are voting overwhelmingly, almost at a 2-to-1 ratio, voting women out, even though all the directors still stay in because they don't have any sway, but they're voting against female directors at a 2-to-1 ratio. And then there's the oil and gas / the, as you call it, the communist sort of approach. I don't know how to gel those things, except that it's just all political opportunism. But why? I can't make sense of this, because it does seem like now, and we did a segment on the show yesterday, I'm defending all the companies that I hate. Right? I am out there saying BlackRock isn't the enemy here. I don't understand. I spent 10 years saying BlackRock doesn't do anything for real. They vote every director in, they vote against every proxy. And now I'm saying wait a minute, BlackRock's capitalists. They are what they are. Why are we saying that they're woke? I don't. Can you actually maybe make me feel better about myself?
Good luck with this answer.
Again, multiple questions. So let me take the first one first, and then the second one, because the second one's a bigger one. The first one, and I think you give by even mentioning Strive as a capital market force, you inflate their influence. They have virtually no assets. You've given
they're nobody.
Ramaswamy much
but
more
Vivek
credit.
was on our show. I want to see.
I know he was on your show, and he has great teeth, and you've given him much more credibility than I think he deserves. But that's okay. He's supposed to be a nice guy, and I actually know people who work for Strive, and they're nice too. So if you're listening to this, Vivek or Laura or anyone else, remember it's business. But
come on the show again.
Snarky. So
yeah, stop ignoring our emails.
Yeah, come back.
The reality is, I think that what a lot of the anti-woke stuff is, remember I said they're arguing from a conclusion. And when you trace it back, a lot of it's funded by the same guy who funded the Supreme Court drift to the right, Leo, whatever his name is, which is what Nell Minow has done brilliantly, tracing it back to him. And the reality is it's a combination of two things. Number one, a feeling by a large percentage of the traditional power base population, which is sort of that the elites, coastal elites, are imposing a value system on them. And there's, I'm not unsympathetic to that view, but it's resulted in a lashing out. And the reason that BlackRock or others were chosen is because for the first time, actually, things were changing and people did have power. And BlackRock was voting more in a certain way. And so it was a new front to open in a war of, quote, traditional values, end quote, versus coastal elites. And that's why, the anti-DEI, the anti-gender diversity plays into that, because when you think of it as an anti-elite battle, and by the way, what's more elite than having a lot of money? So that fits really well.
Led by two Harvard grads and Yale, and
Trump, who was, not as rich as he thinks he is, but certainly wealthy, and yes, we could go on, and and Ron DeSantis went to Yale, and so you're not asking. Are you asking for consistency here? I mean, have you?
No, I guess not. I'm asking to feel better. I don't know how
and
to
then
do
the
that.
second thing is, I think, a major one, which is not a finance thing, which is you have a breakdown of the neoliberal consensus post World War II. You see it around the world. The percentage of there's a group that rates whether you live in an autocracy, a terrorist state, illiberal democracy, or liberal democracy, and the percentage of the world that lives in a liberal democracy has decreased under 30%. Right?
Okay. From what? What was from what number?
It was in the 60s.
Oh, wow.
Actually, it was in the 40s, but it's only in like a year.
Not making me feel better.
Right. And then you have
It's not his job.
Pardon me?
Yeah, we're just saying it just is not making me feel better. And Damien said it's not
Not why
your job.
John's here.
Well, you asked me to explain it. I mean, you didn't ask me to be a therapist. You asked me to explain it. So I can explain. I believe in, as much as I can do it, fact-based analysis. And this is the difference when you get back to your aren't the anti-ESG people. No, I'm not arguing from a conclusion. I'm arguing from this is what's going on in the world.
You guys stink at making me feel better.
I'm not going to answer any more of these questions. I came on to be snarky and have fun, not to have a serious discussion about the end of.
Well, let's have fun.
My game is not fun. My game is not fun.
Damien, do you have a 5-minute game we could play to wrap out this segment?
my quick and dirty, nerdy, agree or disagree corporate governance game. How about that?
Yeah, well, we can make that fun by
it's
being
not
nerdy.
fun.
And
It's nerdy.
Okay, good. Well, you're supposed to play it up.
Yeah,
not play it down.
sure.
You
Yeah,
don't,
but you thoroughly depressed me today.
Oh, look, I don't know what to tell you. I didn't have enough coffee. I don't know what's going on. John, when I come on your pod, I'll be more fun. I'll be ridiculous. But
My
Damien,
pod is a serious, must listen to.
Look.
Interesting people pod. I may withdraw the invitation. I'm not sure.
this podcast is fact-based snark, and sometimes
we are what we say we
it's
are.
sad snark. Yeah. Damien, let's play a quick game. We got, what do you got? 5 questions. Agree or disagree?
Let's call it 6.7.
6.7 questions.
Yeah.
Yes, no, yes, maybe.
Yes.
There you go. Wins.
0.7.
Go ahead. Let's go question
Here
by
we go.
question.
Quickly.
Let's make it quick. Yeah.
Disparate voting rights should be effectively banned. One share, one vote for all.
I am for it. I will enunciate. So that's an unequivocal yes. Once you go public, that is, I should be a condition. Again, I live in the real world. I am willing to go with you're allowed to go public with uneven, but there should be a sunset after, whether it's 5 years or 7 years. But ideally, it should be one share, one vote.
Matt,
nuance. There's no nuance here.
I was thinking about when you're talking about the rise of like autocratic nations. Does it parallel the rise of like autocratic
because
CEOs here in the United States?
Yeah.
Absolutely, because the reality is the argument for unequal voting rights is that Mr., and I will yield to Matt here, it's usually Mr. Founder, is so unique and so wonderful that no one can replace the wisdom and the flexibility of insulating Mr. Wonderful from the marketplace. And the problem, of course, is you're not always wonderful. You reach a stage that founders should give up. And if you don't, you reach the height. Who is the guy? Cable television. I can see him in my mind. And when he was asked,
George Soros.
no, you really fixate on that.
They blame him for everything. I don't know.
Right. No. When asked about succession planning, his answer was, "I don't plan to die."
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it doesn't work.
That's a-
Okay, there we go.
It sounds Ted Turner-ish.
Not Ted.
Talk about Rupert Murdoch. No.
No, he's dead.
Okay,
now.
he's dead now.
He was
All right.
wrong.
Oh, but he,
He
didn't
died,
plan
yeah.
it. He didn't plan it. That's what he said.
Yeah.
Damien, next question.
Controlled companies are not public companies and should be considered private, like X, for instance, your beloved Elon.
Do you really want to give up whatever measure of societal impact you have on X by letting them be considered totally private?
That's what we talk about a lot, right? Like that's the risk, right, in letting some of these companies go private is that we no longer get to get our hands
I think
dirty.
controlled companies are controlled companies, and they are in their own special area, and that there should be extra protections for the non-affiliated share owners. And they are a difficult breed. And I think that therefore Delaware courts should interpret the business judgment rule a little differently on controlled companies like X.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Matt, you have a disgruntled sigh there?
No, I just don't. I keep thinking about why X isn't on an index anymore, but like dual class controlled companies are on indexes, and it's like, what's the fucking point?
The point is those indexes want those companies on their index. That's the point.
You're also looking at what's the purpose of an index, and that's a whole other podcast you could do.
Well,
that one would
we
be
do a lot of
much
podcasts, so
snarkier.
we'll cover that. Yeah,
That's the snarky fun one.
Yeah,
the one about index construction.
Next question is multi-layered. It'll keep going depending on how you answer. We'll start with the overall question.
What way do I stop it? Is there like a
management should be excluded from boards of directors. No management on boards. No insiders.
Interesting question. I am pausing because obviously the U.S. standard is sort of you have one, maybe two insiders on the board. That is not the standard around the rest of the world. And it's not even the standard for a couple of the well-governed companies here. And to me, it is one of those things where it's a cultural issue. I once had a conversation with, in fact, he was on my podcast, the CEO of Henry Schein. Henry Schein is a Fortune 500 company, medical dental product distribution, and I think they have 4 or 5 insiders on their board. And I was postulating your question. And his answer to me was, you have to understand the culture of the board. By having those people, there are people who know every bit as much as I do about what's going on, and they can inform the other board members. And the other board members the independent board members have an open door policy to any of those people. They don't have to let me know they're in the building. They can call them, they can check me out. And so in his case, he was looking at it as a check and balance on the CEO. I think that only works with a very particular type of culture. So I generally prefer fewer executives. To me, it doesn't matter if the CEO is on the board or not. The CEO is going to be present and presenting. I'm on the board of a mutual fund. We actually didn't have any management representatives. We were totally independent, and we changed it and put the CEO of the company on the board because we wanted his ass to have the same legal threat as being a fiduciary board as the rest of us, and the same responsibility as a board member, which is different than just being a CEO. So I'm comfortable with the U.S.
It's a perspective
rule.
I haven't heard before. I like that answer, yeah.
I'm comfortable with the U.S. rule that says one, or it doesn't say.
No, it doesn't.
When I say rule, it's not a regulation. It's
right.
a common state of one or at most two.
All right, then let me jump to the end on this one then, by your answer. Should CEOs be disqualified to be board chairs then? Should they absolutely not be board chairs?
There should be in fact, we have that on this mutual fund board. The CEO is not the board chair. That is a different role. I much prefer having a separate chair, independent chair, and CEO.
It's something we talked about on our show yesterday. Directors should not be appointed to boards directly without an initial shareholder vote. So we have this. The way the mechanism seems to work at American companies is that the board is allowed to appoint a director, right, directly to the board, who then waits for the next annual meeting to get approval from the shareholders. But we're making the case that, why is this allowed to happen? Why aren't they facing an initial vote?
I want them up on stage having debates like presidential candidates at AGMs. Like, well, no, that candidate said they'll do this, but I promised to do that. I want, like, if it's democratic, make it democratic. If it's an appointed position, make it an appointed position. Why are we having like this middle ground, this weird middle ground?
It is confusing.
Stephen Davis, who really is one of the great thinkers in this area. I've written 2 books with Stephen. Initially wanted to have an hour-long call for every board nominee. Ooh. And I pointed out if you own a portfolio of, a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand stocks, and there's an average of 9 trustees, you've used your entire year just to listen to board calls. And I said, well, so, ISS or Glass Lewis or some intermediary will have to summarize. I said, great, now we're giving these people more power, right? And so I don't have a good answer for you. On your question, I think there are still things where a lot of companies where directors don't get the interim appointment do come on with the annual vote.
Yeah, it does happen. Mm-hmm.
That does happen, and it also happens the way you described it. I think the question is why, right? If someone's retiring or resigning or is incapacitated and you're replacing someone, it's one thing. The problem is more deep than that, and there's this great company, Free Float, that has all this information about directors.
I like the segue.
It's true.
All this information.
I heard of them.
Yeah, you have. All this information about directors, and it's really hard for anyone who's not in the boardroom to understand who's a good director and who's not, or even to know who the directors are. I mean, you guys are in the business. Can you tell me every director in the largest company in the world, Microsoft? Like, can you tell me every? No, I couldn't tell you every director of Microsoft. Either.
But it's human nature to want to know and to want to evaluate, right? And to want to create these assessments, right? I mean, this is not human nature.
Absolutely. I'm just saying that again, reality based. If you've got an average of 9 directors, and even if you have 100 stock portfolio, that's 900 directors, and it's really hard to understand them. And so we do rely on intermediaries and data providers like Free Float or ISS or whoever to get it done. So I'm not sure that the question you ask, I can give you an ideological judgment, which is, yes, of course, they should have to stand for election.
Sure.
But in reality, do I think it makes that much of a difference? No.
It doesn't. No.
Wow.
But it doesn't. But according to the data, anyway, it doesn't matter anyway. They'll be voted in irregardless.
Yeah, 96%.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Now, if we can get to a point where they're actual real votes and people really care about the directors, then I'll go with
how about,
what you said.
I'm living that magic land. That's
but how about competing slates of directors? How about instead of just putting up a director for a slot?
You just made it a worse problem.
Okay.
You just made it a harder problem.
Better for me.
Well, you're absolutely correct, and the market actually agrees with you. So you're probably this is a nerdy podcast, so people are aware of proxy access. For those of you who are not aware of it, it's where the shareholders get to nominate a director to the board. We'll just leave it at that. Mm-hmm. And it has a troubled history of it was a proposed rule, then it was judicially overturned, and then the New York City Comptroller, there were only 6 companies in the United States that had it. The New York City Comptroller's office, after me, so I had nothing to do with it, not claiming credit, decided that they were going to try and make this the standard. Mm-hmm. That created a natural experiment. I don't know if you guys are aware, there's actually an academic paper. One of the people was an economist from the SEC that said the mere announcement of proxy access created a 52 basis point excess return. So the market even agrees with you.
I like that.
That there should be more choice and more attention paid to directors. I'm just saying, given the current state of the market, it's not, how often has proxy access been used?
Sure.
not.
Yeah.
And
we're nothing but aspirational over here. So this is
aspirationally, directionally, I'll agree with you, David.
okay. How about one more?
Last one.
American boards should include at least one employee representative. That's an easy one. How about that?
That's your favorite one.
Yeah, that's my
your
favorite. Well,
one.
I have this. I would like to change the system in a way that we could define, instead of defining materiality and all that boring stuff. Because no one's ever going to agree on that. Because it's my case that everything is material, especially in the long term. Because how the hell can you predict whether it will be or won't be?
Matt Levine, everything's security for it. Everything's material.
Yeah, well, it's funny because you were talking about like, doesn't matter what color GM paints its room, purple, pink, whatever. I could read Damien's mind, and he was like, I absolutely want to know if it's purple or pink. Like that to me.
But with the
I'm
generation
investing based on that.
But with the generation coming, they have they can't even afford mortgages, and they can't afford their rent. So they're probably gonna care what the color of the paint is in their workplace, right? Because they have nowhere to go after work.
Damien's dream, just to contextualize this, is a screen that has a scrolling salaries of everyone who works at every company in the lobby, and that everybody in the company has to do a 5-minute stand-up routine every single year because it's the most undressing thing that could possibly happen.
I came of age in the governance under Bob Monks at the corporate library, and disclosure is king. I don't know. I mean, I think sunlight is the best disinfectant. Let's get at it. Let's
a lot of sunlight.
Yeah. So
I'm going to give you an answer you probably don't expect. I have a problem with constituency directors. I have a problem. I don't want a director who's the cybersecurity guy. Or woman. I don't want a director who's the medical person or the pharmaceutical. I don't want, I want directors with that knowledge. And similarly about employees, it sounds good, but what happens is the other directors defer to that director around that issue and don't feel they have to become engaged.
Okay.
And so I want employee issues in the boardroom. I don't in some cases, it may be the way to get them there is to have an employee representative. But in other cases, I'm not sure it is. And then you get into the whole question. And I worked with, the UC pension funds, the boards were half employee union leaders and half city officials. And so I have no problem with them being the employee representative. But when you make it, and for them, that was the appropriate way to get the employee voice heard on those boards. If you're at, I don't know, some multinational manufacturing company, does having, even if it's a union leader from the U.S., deal with your employees in Vietnam? Does it deal with your employees at a different union in the U.S.? And so I want to have employee issues, for every company that says our most valuable asset is our workers and it treats them like shit. I would like them to actually believe that and have that information, whether it is employee satisfaction surveys, ILO rights, a whole host of things discussed in the boardroom. But when you say this is an easy one, for me, it's not an easy one because I don't know that in every circumstance having mandating employee representative in the boardroom answers the question, and I would like the other directors to also take some responsibility for it.
Could it have like the inverse effect of the presence of management on the board, in the sense that the presence of insiders on the board must have a kind of overwhelming effect on the outsiders, right? I mean, there must be a pressure could there be a pressure exerted the other way to have an employee representative in the room to hear these discussions, to be on the inside?
Yes,
could that, right?
Absolutely. And I think getting the viewpoint of employees, and again, I don't want to create artificial barriers with ARDA, getting the viewpoint of employees into the board of directors is critical. The only question we're discussing is what is the mechanism for doing that?
Right, okay.
So I can see if I am, on the board of a car company, I want to talk to Sean Fadden. I want to hear what he's saying in the room. I don't know that I need my UAW rep in the room at every board meeting, but I want to at least, periodically, once a year, semi-annually, have some sort of systematic way of gathering what are the issues that the employees are feeling, how are we doing competitively with employees, a whole host of things. And by the way, that's why I think it's important for whenever I've been on a board of directors, I always want to have employee dinners and go at least 2 levels down from the CEO and know who's around. Part of it's succession planning, but part of it's also just you start getting a feel of what's right and what's wrong and what's going on, right?
Mm-hmm. So we're going to wrap up the pod here. I have to apologize because you're far too interesting for me to have allowed you to be more snarky. So we're going to have to do a follow-up.
I started off snarky. I mean, come on.
In which
there's no requirement.
We because we can have you on to a live show where we play the good game and then it's all like ridiculous silliness, but I had far too many questions. Like I told you before we hit record that I remember from like 15 years ago sitting in a meeting with you and you said one thing that stuck with me for the last 15 years. I've been thinking about future beta and that concept. So I've had like 15 years of built up questions and I didn't get a chance to ask you about like, what Ron DeSantis' favorite color should be and fun things like that. But I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's Jon Lukomnik, the great Jon Lukomnik, the governance expert of governance experts. I don't know, that seems
the governance expert of governance experts. That's impressive.
Yeah, it seems reductive almost, though, doesn't it? It doesn't seem like it's enough credibility. Yeah. But thank you for coming on the show and putting up with our questions.
Thank you, Jon.
It's a little bit, if you're a sports fan, there are 2 ways to get in the Hall of Fame: to be really good, which you're implying, or to be around for a long time and be a piler, which is what I actually think my career's been. So thanks a lot for elevating me to a different status.
Either one, you're in the Hall of Fame. You don't look back and say, like how you got there. It's just that you made the bar. That's it. Yeah. Jon Lukomnik, thank you so much.
Thanks, man.
That's it. If you don't follow Jon at Outside In, his podcast, go do that, especially because I'm going to be on it. As if you can't get enough of listening to me talk. Like everyone in my office right now is rolling their eyes. Big thanks to Jon for showing up here. Otherwise, we'll be back as a full crew on Friday to wrap the week. Until then, goodbye.